Thank you. Our first speaker for today is Professor Shaleen Singhal. Good morning, sir. I hope you can hear me.
Good morning, Ms. Sureka.
Yes, sir. Yeah. So I'll just introduce you and we can start the formal session. So Professor Shaleen Singhal, he's a professor and dean, research and partnerships, TERI School of Advanced Studies, New Delhi, India. He is a fellow of the Higher Education Academy, UK, and had been a visiting Fulbright fellow at Yale University, US. He works on themes such as sustainable smart cities, climate change, sustainable consumption, redevelopment, public policy and planning, and has led several multidisciplinary research and consultancy assignments with a focus on India and other developing countries. He is an architect planner with a globally awarded PhD from Ulster University. He contributes actively to doctoral programs at leading architecture and planning schools in India. Hearty welcome to you, sir, to SPA Bhopal and to this workshop session. Over to you.
Thank you, Ms. Sureka. And first of all, let me thank School of Planning and Architecture, Bhopal, for inviting me to share my thoughts on this very important, pertinent theme that the school has taken up. And I really congratulate the Department of Architecture and the school for developing and offering this conference for faculty members, scholars, and students on this theme of circular economy, something that is very close to our domain and discipline of architecture and planning both. And with that, I'll just, if you allow me to share my presentation, it's a brief presentation for the participants.
So are you able to share your screen? Yes.
Yeah, is it there?
Yes, we can see the screen. Yeah.
Okay, so my talk for the next 20 minutes is going to focus on our looking at the participation at this particular conference. Will focus on architecture planning and its linkages with circular economy in cities. So, as a context, what we are looking at, and to take cognizance of the context, we're all aware that the 20th century was mainly focused on expansion. Sorry. Just hold on, sorry. The 20th century mainly focused on the expansion, whereas in the 21st century, we have actually gone into multiple challenges and the transformations that have taken place. We have moved from reducing our focus on reducing environmental impact to now on radical rethinking with the focus on redesigning and actually minimizing environmental impacts from the start. We have gone from earlier focus on growth, then to degrowth and green growth, which we are currently looking at through transition to these principles, through transformations that are happening, and with specific focus on eco-innovation in cities. If we look at why we are focusing on this particular theme that the school has put together, and take a cognizance that rapid urbanization in cities, particularly in the region where we are, the Asia Pacific region, it's clearly indicating resource intensive growth that has been happening in the last couple of years and decades. It is also evident that despite of the slowdown in a post-pandemic scenario in this era, India will be the third largest consumer market globally by the next couple of years. This is the number that we have come across multiple times. If we focus on the urban population, it is likely to be doubled by 2050 to around 800 million people. All of this is resulting into unsustainable consumption of resources, particularly on energy and material that shall rise in cities. For example, India's energy demand is likely to be doubled in the next less than 2 decades by 2040, and the main focus or the contribution of that will be on appliance ownership and also on the needs for cooling the buildings and the built environment. If we look at the material consumption, it is expected that with particular focus on construction sector's contribution, that the annual consumption of around 1200 to 1300 metric ton of construction minerals is likely to happen and is happening currently as well. Also, to look at why we are focusing in a particular agenda, which is very recent one on climate change, and the emphasis that has been brought together through our focus on the recently happened COP26. There are certain keywords that have emerged and we are faced with, such as trust between the developed and the developing nations, such as the focus on measurable outputs, such as the focus on equity, and the significance of time when the assistance or participation or collaboration is happening. We have all witnessed India's participation and strong communication that has happened in this global conference. And I'm putting forward some of the questions that are critical for us to take cognizance of. How critical are adequacy, timings, and continual growth in relation to one of the most important and, let's say, agenda of conflict, which was climate finance? How important is its quantum or adequacy? And I'm referring again to India's objection on the kind of things that have happened in the 100 billion climate finance funding to be generated by the developed world. It is also important for us as the universities and higher education institute to take cognizance of how far we have reached and how far we can go in terms of scientific knowledge and also on the complementarity of the dimensions on behavioral change, and that is particularly with respect to our context of built environmental planning. Can there be knowledge-based route for convergence between the completely polar apart developed and developing countries take on this particular issue of climate science, climate crisis? And what is it that that is the higher education institutions or universities, can do for the India's targeted carbon neutrality? We are aware that it's India's commitment now, a modest commitment to reach, let's say, net zero or carbon neutral by 2070. In this, universities like the School of Planning and Architecture at Bhopal and other schools and TERI University do have a vital role, both in terms of evidence-based global advocacy, some of it we saw at the COP26, and also universities' role in actually assisting the domestic circular economy-based transformations that the country is aspiring for to address the issue of climate resilience. I'm just reading a statement from our former President of India, late Shri Pranab Mukherjee ji, and he mentioned this, that on the one hand, over 1.25 billion people are still living in poverty, while on the other, patterns of unsustainable production and consumption are endangering our planet's ecosystem. And this actually creates and presents us with an opportunity, particularly in working together. And this was something that he mentioned at the inaugural session of the World Sustainable Development Summit organized by TERI in 2016. But how do we interpret in recent times is reflected through this conceptual graph, that if we emphasize on circular economy led policies and actions in cities particularly, and considering cities as hotspots of unsustainable production and consumption, then it is very clear that the red arrow coming down, I think there is a mistake here, the red arrow coming down, the climate impact shall be reduced, whereas the green arrow, resource efficient growth, shall be assisted. It is also important to acknowledge how universities should address climate emergency through circular economy route in this current decade. What is required is science-based advocacy by the universities for sharply drawing attention to ecological and climate emergencies in cities particularly. We are all aware that the Gen Z, the youth, is now much more vocal and do demand for all the key stakeholders, government, business, and us as universities and communities to act concretely and immediately. And therefore, engagement and the kind of engagement and the structured approach to engagement is critical here. And the universities do have competitive advantage of partnerships with the youth. Particularly planning and architecture focused progressive universities or higher education institutions who are working also on overarching themes such as public policy, sustainability, and climate change. They are upscaling their efforts, and they do need to also assist other such universities in integration of themes like these, both through curriculum and pedagogy. And TERI University is partner with such alliance, one of which is Prosper.net Alliance of Asia Pacific, universities in Asia Pacific, and the other one is an International Universities Climate Alliance at the global level, in which around 45 plus universities globally are participating. It's also important that we do address this through building multi-scalar technical as well as governance capacity, while creating what we are doing already, a cadre of informed, capable, and sensitive urban development professionals who are focused on built environment and planning for that. Our sectoral thrust has to be particularly on sustainable consumption and production. And I understand yesterday it was in the inaugural as well, this was being referred, the SDG 12, and its alignment with the SDG 11 on cities. And also focus on key thrust areas such as energy, transport, built environment, and so on. It's also important to acknowledge that we already have been into transition from earlier concepts of garden city, this is particularly with the planning and urban development, moving to eco-city and now to climate compatible cities. We have also moved from focus on quantifying the emissions now to focus on behavioral science. We have moved on also from whistleblowing to co-production of the evidence base which can create such advocacy. We have also moved from emphasis on actual outputs and rather on impacts on the fundamental dimensions that are required or that may create that change, such as governance, information or database, and the emphasis on the fourth pillar of sustainable development, which is culture. We also have to take this route, universities in particular, from knowledge production to now multi-dimensional interventions that the universities are expected to play. Just very quickly on the challenges that we have seen in the past, present, and future. Some of these were referred way back in early 70s as wicked problems. We see these are the same wicked problems which are standing in front of us today as well. And circular economy certainly is an important route to address many of these. It is also important to take a note whether we had really taken the lessons from the 2008 global recession and now in this era of COVID-19 impacted world. If we look at the circular economy for carbon neutrality, which the country is aiming at, it is requiring a top-down approach along with the bottom-up interventions, which calls that this post-pandemic crisis management should not happen at the cost of future. When we are talking of carbon neutrality, for achieving the net zero emissions, GHG emissions, it has to be by balancing those emissions so that they are equal or less than the emissions that get removed through planet's natural absorption. This is what it means by. It is also clear that the International Panel on Climate Change has advocated also for carbon neutrality. This has further been reiterated through COP26. And our own Niti Aayog has also advocated for the paradigm shift to cleaner energy, which will be critical for the sustainable economies, particularly in a post-COVID-19 era. This is just to indicate the 17 goals, which have been much referred time and again, but particular attention on the goal number 12 on responsible consumption and the goal number 11, that is on sustainable cities and communities, that cut across and have linkages to all goals. I'm particularly referring to the sustainable consumption and production and its linkages to built environment that we are concerned with. And this graphics actually presents the entire life cycle approach or the various stages of built environment where interventions are required, starting, let's say, from sustainable resource management to even design for sustainability, focus on eco-labeling, transport, procurement, marketing, and of course, life cycle along with the waste management. It is important that while we are aiming to address sustainable consumption and production and resource efficiency in particular within the built environment focus in cities, we do take a life cycle analysis approach targeting for carbon neutral urban areas or cities. And if we look at that, then this particular approach actually calls for the bottom tier, which is database, the data. That is a big challenge in our urban sector. And the next tier goes on to the life cycle approaches, building upon the database, which then can assist us in realistic program activities being planned, which then can help us in establishing life cycle management systems, and that ultimately will help us in the targeted sustainability through the circular economy route. This is a framework that I'm presenting for the participants, which is being referred as the tiered framework for circular economy, focused particularly on energy management, one of the critical areas for circular economy in cities, that is now highlighting the importance of effective governance. And this is again multi-scalar governance, whether it is at the regional level, city and the region, to a precinct level or the building level itself. The focus on innovative finance and how do we tap the financing models, newer financing models, whereas create newer revenue generating streams, particularly, for example, focusing on the real estate and its linkages with urban transport or other infrastructure. The focus on technology management, and here again at the buildings level, as we are all concerned as architects and planners, on the services component, particularly on the HVAC systems, more so on the commercial buildings. I'm just highlighting some of the examples of what these mean. And most important is the information and capacity to handle and activate, analyze, and use such information, starting from the database management. And then is the bottom-up approach, wherein we are already acknowledging the limits to the global resource capacity. We and our buildings, which are consuming beyond these limits, design approach and architecture actually has limited mention in the discourse on sustainable consumption. And I'm sure this conference is making an attempt to bring together these two discourses. And therefore, it is important to understand whether architecture can, and planning particularly, can take lead in supporting the sustainable consumption. If we are looking on some of these images of buildings where I got the chance to be using and being part of these buildings. On the top is the Kroon Hall at Yale University. And the bottom is, of course, all of you recognize that the India Habitat Center. It is important to look at the building life cycle through manufacturing, production, consumption, and use when we are targeting its bottom-up approach of the buildings on the circular economy dimension. I've already mentioned the criticality of the emphasis on services and HVAC systems, particularly lighting, insulation, photovoltaic panels, and material. Also, another important area for the schools and the faculty members and researchers to address is on resource efficient redevelopment, and we are aware that it is one of the most critical area for our cities in India, which have a huge potential on redevelopment, and these are already undergoing a lot of redevelopment initiatives that are happening, and therefore emphasis on the brownfield development. It's also to draw your attention on the ecosystem approach and the pedagogy that we require for this ecosystem approach, where we interpret building as a product, and that's a wider interpretation, and we focus on the three market systems simultaneously to have a comprehensive approach towards circular economy rooted through built environment. We focus on the occupiers market of the buildings or the built environment being created, the developers market, and the investors market. And here again, the influence of architects and planners is critical. We do focus on both the product, that is the final output of the building, and the process that is happening to take that forward. If that happens, certainly it will create a positive spiral. Here is again an opportunity by looking at the current ongoing mission and the Government of India's emphasis through smart cities, wherein three broad agendas of redevelopment, retrofitting, as well as greenfield development are being emphasized. I'm just sharing some of the examples of the sustainability informed solutions that are trying to address evidence-based research, and some of these research-based examples that we have been part of, such as the focus on smart sustainable cities. How do we comprehend that, and particular focusing on the governance dimension and also on leapfrogging towards environmental and ecology. Ecological and environment competitiveness of cities. Another one is to focus on inclusiveness dimension of the smart cities. We also have looked at the cultural dimension, and we heard yesterday even Professor Rahul Mehrotra's example of the Kumbh Mela. And this is particularly very, very important in some of the cities which are of critical in nature, such as the heritage-led cities or the religion-led cities, which have unique dimensions which are to be addressed. Another important area is, while we focus on built environment, it is critical that in this entire approach to river development, green infrastructure planning for resource efficiency is becoming critical. Finally, database, in which we have looked at one particular area in which data had been very unreliable, is to look at the nexus between real estate and transport infrastructure, and also on construction and demolition waste management. These two areas there have been a lot of discrepancy and confusions relating to database. And the third way that universities can address, and we have made some modest attempt, is on curriculum and pedagogy. We are trying to address circular economy and principles and focus on urban conflicts, such as through a course on sustainable consumption and production and on sustainable urbanization being taught for the first time in India from a developing country's perspective, particularly on SCP, to our mid-career civil servants sponsored by the Government of India through a public MA program in public policy and sustainable development, and another one through young students of MTech in urban development management and on climate science and policy. These are some of the examples of the student outputs, wherein students have assisted several cities in their approach towards climate resilience, circular economy, smartness, and inclusiveness. Finally, I would end with the quote from Mahatma Gandhi, that reduce resource intensity of production, undertake new patterns with reduced levels of consumption, and change what is consumed and by whom. It is also important to acknowledge that sustainability will come a full circle only when the local knowledge is recognized and given its due importance. And that's where a university's role is extremely critical. Thank you.